Good morning. Today we're going to talk about trends that relate to urbanization, everything from why income levels differ in cities compared to suburbs, and challenges that folks living in cities have faced since the 1950s onward, and what has changed in cities since as well. Today you guys are going to take notes. Then when the notes are finished, you guys are going to get on Google Classroom and plan your own city out using a PowerPoint scenario that will be found in Google Classroom under McCarrick heading. That is due by the end of class if you can finish it. If not, it'll be due by the beginning of next class. And then it's all set in Google Classroom. And just to look forward a little bit, you will have a quiz on urbanization next Thursday and Friday right before spring break. If you're not going to be here, make arrangements with me the first of next week to get it done before you go on break. And now let's go on with the show. Unlike cities of 100 years ago, what you're going to see in the inner city today is a lot of high concentrations of folks who have low income levels, whereas the wealthier folks and middle class folks have moved to the outer edges of the cities and to the suburbs. You do have a move, though, called gentrification, where young folks in their 30s and late 20s and early 30s are moving back into the city, and some other folks as well, and buying up older houses, fixing them up, and then moving into them. But it depends on what areas of the cities you're talking about. But the majority of cities in the United States, what used to be housing that was near the CBD has fallen into disrepair. The rents are cheap, and you're going to have more of folks who fit more into the low income bracket. Issues that folks struggle with: physical, because of deterioration of properties; social, everything from discrimination to crime to drug use to abuse, and then economic issues as well, which we'll delve into more of those as we go along. All right, as far as physical issues, again, a lot of the housing that you will see in the inner cities, the buildings and housing near the central business district, most of them were built prior to 1940 in some cities where you have President Johnson during the 1960s, where he had the movement where you had the development of low-income housing or subsidized housing. Those houses were mostly built in the 60s, early 70s. Those are starting to be redone in a lot of places, but most of these houses or apartment buildings are falling apart. The rent's really cheap. They might not have air conditioning. They might have window units. In a lot of these places too, you have old businesses where the windows have been boarded up because the companies have moved out. Factories are no longer used, so you have a lot of abandoned buildings, which unfortunately tend to be open and available for squatters to come in. They also tend to be the area where folks might come and hang out, where drug dealers hang out as well. So it can be a tough challenge for cities to figure out what to do with blocks and blocks of abandoned buildings. The city of Detroit has actually gone in and just raised a lot of these buildings, and now you have these open green spaces. But Detroit's an exception from the standpoint that they had a lot of people move out of the city because of the fact that they couldn't afford their rents on their apartments or the mortgages on their houses, and so you just had blocks and blocks of abandoned houses and buildings. So they're more of a unique situation. There are a couple of things that led to the deterioration of social issues that you have. One, the situation is that a lot of these lower income folks, they have a hard time. It's very difficult for them to get out of their situation that they're in, most because they're trapped in this cycle. You have high rates of unemployment. A lot of these families or individuals are relying on government assistance, whether it's welfare or for their income. They also might rely on the government for health benefits as well. And because that's difficult, they might end up with alcohol, going to alcoholism, drug addiction. A lot of them don't drop out of school because they're trying to find whatever work they can. So then you have illiteracy as well. They might have to resort to crime because they can't pay their bills, so they're just trying to make money where they can. And again, because you don't have the tax base to support schools and other public facilities, and you're also going to have, you need tax money to pay for fire and police protection, the city is going to allocate resources where the tax base is. So often these neighborhoods aren't going to have as many access to resources, maybe other wealthier parts of the city. So that becomes an issue. You also have a lot of folks who can't afford to pay rent and are homeless, and if they don't have a fixed address, it's often hard for them to get a job. And it's higher now probably than when these notes were done. It's estimated that we have over 1 million homeless in America. It's probably closer to maybe 1.5 million, probably at least over 1 million at this point. The situation is still pretty bleak for a lot of these folks. Fewer than half of them complete high school. They really don't have a lot of technical training needed to do more technical jobs, whether it's in the service industry or construction, things like that. And there really aren't a lot of opportunities in the primary sector. There's some in the secondary sector, but without the training or just basic habits that they might have gotten able to pick up, it's very difficult for them to get a job. So there are programs to try and work with that, mostly through nonprofits that are making headway, but there are major changes that are going to have to be done to help kind of break this cycle. Another situation is about 3/4 of the babies born in the inner city are to unwed mothers. And a lot of these, pretty much 3/4 of the children live with one parent, tend to be moms. And they tend to stay at home because they need to take care of the kids because there are no dads around to help, but then they can't work if they're staying home. So again, that kind of further complicates the cycle. There are, again, programs in certain cities where they're trying to provide childcare for the moms so they can go out and work and support their families, but it's very tough. Most of, not so much at this point, but you do have high rates of drug use in the inner city, but with the opioid epidemic now, it's not only an inner city problem anymore. People used to say that drug use was only in the inner city. That's not the case. Particularly within recent years, the opioid epidemic hits every income level. In rural areas, it's more opioids and meth. In the inner city, it's going to be opioids and other drugs as well. And again, in a lot of major cities, gangs control the drug trade, and you often have gang violence, which goes across all different ethnic lines. And neighborhoods are lots segregated in inner cities. That goes way back to when urbanization first developed here in the United States. As immigrants came over from Europe, you would have Little Italy, you'd have Little Poland, things like that. Over time, that changed as those immigrants obtained jobs and became wealthy and moved to other parts of the city. Then it became more segregated between maybe to go to Chinatown, Little Havana, different things like that. So now mostly what you're going to find in the inner city is African American neighborhoods, Hispanic neighborhoods. You will see Asian as well, and other immigrants as they come in, because they're going to start in the city where housing is cheaper and then move out into the suburbs if they can over time. But a lot of these folks get stuck because there aren't a lot of, it's a very complicated problem and there's not an easy solution. Economic issues. Again, as I mentioned before, the eroding tax base becomes an issue because there aren't the taxes to support the services. You're going to see the central city having a bigger gap. They have to provide services, but they don't have the funds for it. So they either have two choices. They can reduce services or raise the tax revenue on the businesses that are there. And some cities have been able to find a balance from the standpoint that they've redone their central business district. Baltimore did the Inner Harbor in the late 90s, early 2000s, and have increased their tax base, but it hasn't necessarily made it all the way out to the lower income parts of Baltimore, which are more out on the fringe because people kind of got relocated as they redid the central business district. And even with the balance, you still got taxes on abandoned buildings. What do you do with those abandoned buildings? So that is still a major question for cities, particularly in the central part of the area. The federal government's decreased the amount of aid that they've given to cities, particularly for subsidized housing and things like that. For the most part, the government has stopped the project that was started by President Johnson in the 60s with the Americans Great Society, creating that. With the recession of 2008, you had a collapse of the housing market. A lot of those folks who took out or given loans to buy townhouses and condos and things like that came from the inner city. And when the people had poor credit, they didn't do background checks, and they were given loans and they defaulted on them, that caused a huge ripple effect. So like I said, in Detroit, you've got blocks and blocks of houses that were just raised because people moved out because they couldn't afford the mortgages because they defaulted on their loans. So as you can see over time, houses have considered to be an investment. As interest rates get higher, investments should go up, but that's been an issue since the recession. Things are a little bit more stable now since the market crashed at that point. It was the housing market did. And again, with the concentric model, what helped cause the recession was that banks saw a way to increase the number of homeowners they had, but people couldn't repay their loans. So that became a problem. And now a lot of these houses were worth less than their mortgage were worth. So it was kind of an upside down. So people were upside down loans. But things have pretty much stabilized since then. And so ghettoization has developed over for three primary reasons. One, it first started with the first huge wave of immigration into the U.S. from Eastern and Western Europe in the late 1800s, as people came to work in factories and other industries in major cities in the U.S. But as time goes on, those people made money. Then they moved out of the tenements and moved into wealthier areas of the city, and eventually the suburbs after World War II. Starting in the 1950s, you start to see, again, as we mentioned before, the wealthier and the middle class move out of the city into the suburbs. And then those areas pretty much became the home of African Americans, Hispanic, large Asian population as immigration from those areas picked up in the 1970s. Three ways that the ghettos developed. One is called blockbusting, where real estate agents would use racism to their benefit. They would say if you had a predominantly white neighborhood, they would bring someone in from an ethnic minority to kind of freak people out. So, because the neighborhood's changing, to take advantage of that attitude that was predominant at that time. And unfortunately, in some areas, it's still predominant today. And then people would freak out and start moving. And then the real estate agents and the banks would make a profit off of that. Another is called racial steering, where you would purposely steer clients towards certain areas of town. This is the African American section, this is the white section, that type of thing. And that contributed to housing being segregated. And the last one is redlining, which we've already talked about. All right, city reform, again, you've had lots of attempts to try and change or attack this problem in the inner city. One, again, is urban renewal. I mentioned Baltimore before. So you're looking at certain neighborhoods within cities and trying to help folks in these areas acquire property and then help them to move and then come in and demolish the ghettos, and the government helped finance this. And so some old neighborhoods have been destroyed, and then some people argue you have a lack of cheaper housing. In the 60s, this was some people call this Negro removal. For the most part, now most folks in the U.S. and Canada and Western Europe have moved away from this, but this did happen a lot after World War II. The government came in England, for example, and just moved lower income residents. They demolished where they lived and built these high-rise apartments and helped fund them in. So you have the national housing that occurred, public housing, which, for example, occurred under President Johnson's Great Society program. So you have the low tenement housing that was destroyed, and then you have public housing that was created, and the rents were subsidized, so they were cheaper. You might pay about 30% of your income for rent. They were maintained by a housing authority, which was mostly run by the city, and it was only about 1% of all the dwellings in the inner city. And the government's pretty much stopped funding of this probably by the late 80s. And so instead of renovating, so what most folks are looking to do now is that instead of stopping that program, they're looking at trying to renovate buildings from the 50s and 60s. One example of this is in Alexandria. They have a project that was done from the 60s. They've gone on and completely redone it and offering it to, members of the city of Alexandria for reasonable rents, but they've completely redone it. Completely taken the attitude, taken the label of low-income housing and changed it, and it's been pretty successful. Another situation is that you have nonprofits going in and buying these buildings from or the government and subsidizing the rents and things like that. This is something that Habitat for Humanity does in the inner city, whereas in other places they build houses from scratch. They're doing this in the inner cities, taking existing places and fixing them up and then helping run them with subsidized rent. So these are some pictures of urban renewal. This is in Brooklyn, talking about urban renewal fighting it because, or helping to fight it because they don't want their neighborhood changed. This is, again, in the 60s, a variety of people fighting it because they want to keep their neighborhoods the way they are. This is St. John in Canada, where they completely transformed the city, and so this is a different graphic of it. All right, gentrification. I mentioned this earlier. Gentrification is where you take middle class or wealthier folks and they move into the inner city. They buy up houses, say like townhouses that had been subdivided or were living, or what we call row houses. And what they do is they go in and they hire a contractor. They might do it themselves, and they renovate it to more of their standards. And what happens, it's cheaper for them to live in the city because they probably work in the city. They like the architecture details. It's closer to work most of the time. They don't have children, so they're not really concerned about living in the inner city as far as the schools go, but they want to have access to the cultural areas, good restaurants, things like that. And so Washington, D.C. has gone through a lot of gentrification, as you can see from this picture. Chicago, New York City has had a lot of gentrification as well. But what you're starting to see is that as gentrification happens in the center of the city, it's pushing out your Hispanic and African American populations more to the outer edge. This happened in Baltimore as well when they went through the urban renewal back in the late 90s, early 2000s. Might have been a little bit earlier than that. And renovations are expensive. Again, cities are giving low-cost loans to folks to come in and fix up these houses. So, and some people argue that they're encouraging middle-class folks to move in and low-class folks to move out. But a lot of the U.S. and a lot of other countries have laws to protect people because, again, from the standpoint that they don't want lower-income folks to be forced out because it's all places where to go. And again, some people argue it's helping to disperse lower-income families more throughout the city than just clumping them in one area, which would then help with the tax base. so that if they need the services, then they can actually get them. So there are pros and cons both to gentrify. One of the ways that cities expanded up until about the 20th century is that they would annex land around the city. It was always legally, they didn't go in and just take it. But there were certain rules to annex territory varied from state to state. But usually the people living in that area had to agree to it. And often it was because they wanted to take advantage of the services that the city had to offer. Schools, police protection, things like that. Today, it's less likely because people don't want to pay the high taxes that cities have to offer. Urban settlements, defining it, a city is a legal entity. It has political boundaries. It is incorporated. Its authority is recognized by the state, things like that. An urbanized area is an area that's continuously built up around a city. And then an MSA or metropolitan statistical area is more of a functional area that is tied to a city. So again, definition of a city, it's an urban settlement that has been incorporated. It's a self-governing unit, so usually it's a mayor, the city council, and people are elected from the city to represent the interest of their different parts of the city, things like that. And usually you've got the central city, but then you have suburbs, and often those suburbs can be independent towns as well. And then they have their own governments acting for them. Sometimes they're towns. In Virginia, they're counties, but then you have towns with or cities within those counties, so it can get kind of gray. An urbanized area is a central city and then the suburbs around it. As we mentioned before, now it's about 75% of the US population lives in urban areas. When these notes were originally done, it was about 70%. And a functional area is more of an area that has about 50,000 people. The counties that surround a city, and usually they have, it's more functional because it has to do with like newspaper distribution, TV broadcasting networks, radio distribution, how far radio signals go for radio stations, as well as looking at the reach of baseball, major league teams, football, baseball, different things like that as well. Yes, I did mention baseball first because that's my favorite. All right, counter-urbanization. Also, in the last 20 or 30 years, you start to see, obviously, the development, and I'm going back a little further than that. You have the rise of cities, but then you have the people moving out of the cities. Again, you have an increase in rural population, people moving out of the cities into the suburbs because they've like more land, they've like the fresh air, that type of a thing. And so what you're going to start to see is in the 1950s, you have the suburbs developed, but then you also have what's called the exurbs. So these are areas, wealthier communities outside of the suburbs, larger tracts of land, bigger houses, things like that. One thing that's helped a lot is the highways, being able to get into town. Also, things like the metro has helped people be able to commute. Telecommuting has helped quite a bit too. People can live further out and use technology to commute to work electronically as opposed to driving in a car. Right, to look at the peripheral model, which we talked about last class, was developed by Chauncey Harris, looking at the development of cities and suburbs in the US. DC would be considered to be a peripheral model because you have the central city and then you have the suburbs connected to it by a beltway. But you also have nodes or areas that have kind of formed off of that central city. And mostly originally it was suburban residents, but then it's grown around with like airports and hotels and malls and things like that. Tyson's Corner right now would be considered an edge city because you have the mall, you have hotels, you have businesses there. It's near Dulles Airport, things like that. So Tyson's does fit the definition of an edge city. All right, suburban sprawl. You have two definitions with this. The density gradient is as you travel from the center city, population declines, so closer to the center city, the higher concentration of population is. And urban sprawl is how land is used in the city. And again, you're taking land that used to be agricultural and now it's used for houses, office buildings, different things like that, because you have to take account for the growth of that city. All right, the cost of suburban sprawl. One, you have uneven development. You have some areas of the city that are more developed and have, or even the suburbs have, better schools. The houses are newer or better, better shape because of the income level of the folks living in that area. And then you have other parts of the city or the suburbs that are lower income and less access to services. And again, so you can definitely see the gaps between wealthy and the poor. A great example of this would have been Rio in 2016, where you have the Olympics were held mostly in the wealthier part of the city, and they just built walls around the poorer part so tourists wouldn't see it. So the development of the suburbs did cause a huge discrepancy in access to services too, because in the suburbs where you have the higher tax base, you have access to all the better public schools, fire, police protection. In the inner city, the tax base isn't as high, and the quality of schools is going down for public schools. I mean, you have private schools, but most of the residents can't afford to send their kids to public school. So, to private school. So that makes a difference. All right, segregation within the suburbs. Again, there are a couple consequences with suburbs. One, you do have some segregation within the suburbs, which I'll talk about in a minute. But you also have land use that's divided up in the suburbs. So with the city, you at least had, things where you've got a blend of, you have wealthy folks living not too far from lower income folks. You have businesses that, cross lines. So you had, lower income folks going into the wealthy parts to work and then going back home. So you had a mix. Whereas in the suburbs, you don't see a lot of crossing over into the suburbs. In the suburbs, you might have, like in Sterling, for example, where I live, you have the newer parts of Sterling, say like Lowe's Islands. That is where Trump's golf course is. It's very wealthy. The homes are like $600,000 to $800,000. You go 5 minutes down the road, and you have Sugarland, which was developed in the 1960s, early 70s. It was one of the first, and it was like the second of subdivisions in Loudoun County, at least at the eastern end. And it, at the time, was a haven for middle class residents. Today, it's where a lot of your lower income folks live. And, so when you go to Dominion High School, you have a mix of the folks from Rose Island mixing with the kids from Sugarlands. And it's, it's the same address, it's the same zip code, but a very difference in just income level. Now they have access to the same schools, the same fire protection, the same police, things like that, but just access to going to the pool, different things like that are even segregated because of the income level of the neighborhood. All right, businesses. Again, a lot of businesses have moved to the suburbs. If you're gonna have manufacturing, it's gonna be on the outer edges of those suburbs because of land costs. Most of your businesses are gonna be closer to their customers, so you're gonna have mixed development. So again, a lot of your folks aren't going to go into the central part of the city to go shopping at retail stores and restaurants. Now they might go do that for a concert or see a play, but a lot of that shifted into the suburbs because that's where they live. So malls, now it's mostly online, depending on where you go, but still a lot of people shopping at the mall, but a lot of your activity where people used to go into the central part of the city or the CBD to do it is now done in the suburbs. And again, most of your offices and things like that are in the suburbs because land is cheaper as opposed to the city. And because of technology too, you don't necessarily have to you don't necessarily have to be in the office to do business. So technology has cut back on that too. So you have lots of office buildings, even here in Long County, that are empty because of telecommuting and different things like that. All right, another thing that has helped things change in the city is transportation. In the 1920s, you had the trolley, which allowed folks to come in from not too far out from the city into from the suburbs into the city. And then the 1950s, with the development of interstate highway systems under President Eisenhower, you start to see more people move out from the city into the suburbs. And then now with public transportation like metro and light rail, more people are living farther out and coming into the city to work. And again, transportation, just in regards to moving goods and services, that has increased. So businesses, again, are moving farther out from the city into area where land is cheaper. So how do you contain urban sprawl, or how do you change things? European cities and London have tried to kind of limit urban development and have tried to, make it more green. So what they said is, look, urban development can happen in the CBD, but any housing and stuff has to be more on the outside of the city, because of the fact that we want to kind of maintain the quality of our city. North American cities have had a harder time doing that because they want to attract people who want to develop land, but they want to kind of balance out that rural area and central city. So Portland's one example of it, that they've been able to do this. What they've done is develop the inner city, but also kind of halted the growth of the suburbs. It worked, but it did increase the cost of living in the city. So it was kind of tough. Another thing that you have done is a lot of people have changed the way that cities have developed. So you have what we call a new urbanization, which is taking cities and making them healthier. So you walk everywhere. You have access to, taking parks that might not have been kind of maintained and redeveloped, and putting jogging paths in and biking paths. So replacing the use of cars with bikes and, hybrid vehicles. So basically trying to reduce people's reliance on cars and light rail, bicycles, walking. So basically putting everything people need in certain areas to make just cities more healthier and less reduce pollution and things like that. So that is another thing that a lot of cities are doing these days. And urbanism, which I mentioned before, is again trying to balance out that healthy living with sustainable lifestyles, and again planning out neighborhoods. So like you could argue Reston was an example of that. When they built it, it's more of a playing community, but Reston has walking trails, it has lakes, it's got a green space in it, so, and very secure as well. And in other cities like Chicago and Baltimore, they redesigned the waterfront where you have festivals, and it's kind of the focus of things. So urbanism is a very big focus of a lot of these cities, again trying to attract people to try and reinvent the city as well. So we're going to stop this here. What I'm going to put in on the next slide is a screenshot of where to go in Vision to use the planning city for the care rack city. What you're going to do is open up the PowerPoint file, read the instructions. You're going to click and drag the different pictures of the element for the city. For example, you're going to figure out where to put the industry, the churches, the houses, and you're going to save that PowerPoint file on your H drive, and then save it under you and your partner's name, and then upload it to Vision, answer the questions in the PowerPoint file, and then you will be done with that. And your homework again is the urbanization quiz and vocab, which is due on the 17th and 18th, depending on when you see me. So thank you very much.